Hey, Pushins, Mr. Amato here, coming with your activity 4 on World War One Part 2. So we already studied on the last one on what the causes of World War One is, and this one will focus on the Paris Peace Conference, the Treaty of Versailles, which we kind of already introduced slightly because of the 14 points. We really didn't talk about the Treaty of Versailles. We just kind of set it up that Woodrow Wilson was excited to, or was hoping to instill some of the ideas of the 14 points in the Treaty of Versailles or in the peace negotiations. So we'll talk a little bit more, get a little more details about that. Talk about the only point in our last activity in the actual activity that you guys completed. As you guys noticed, that Woodrow Wilson really was the only point he was able to get was the League of Nations, and this one he really wanted to make sure it passed, and so we'll talk about that as well. Then lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about what was happening at home during World War One, kind of rewinding during the war rather than talking about all the politics, but socially, what was happening here within the United States. And so we'll get into that as well. All right, so let's get into it. So as you guys know, ultimately the Treaty of Versailles is the one that kind of is the most important of multiple treaties during the Paris Peace Conference. So you have the Paris Peace Conference in Paris, and then there are multiple treaties that come out of it. The Treaty of Versailles really is focused on the German side of the war. And the two big things that you kind of want to know about the Treaty of Versailles is the first of all was the reparations that they were forced to. They were actually the first thing you might want to know is that they said that they had to actually declare that they were guilty of starting World War One. Now, Khan Academy is going to go into this deeply, and historians have gone this deeply. Like, not necessarily were they the only cause of World War One. There was multiple causes that were happening in World War One, not just Germans' entrance into it. But other historians may argue that they were probably the more hostile and really, got this thing going the fastest. So they were forced to pay these reparations. The reparations were burdensome. I mean, in this political cartoon, you have someone basically being weighed underneath literally the debt and the weight of these reparations. And a lot of historians would argue that both the war guilt clause, the reparations, kind of put a lack of faith in the German government. This hastily created German government that signed this, the Treaty of Versailles, and kind of led the way for Adolf Hitler to deeply criticize the current government and kind of take hold of it, and people to basically abandon this kind of half democratic Weimar Republic and move towards this kind of fascist dictatorship that he creates. So those are the two kind of aspects of the Treaty of Versailles that you really, really want to know. And as far as the German side, another thing about the Treaty of Versailles, like we discussed earlier, is the League of Nations. Woodrow Wilson kind of gives into all these points. In my previous video, if you watched it, I kind of talked about how the French were very critical of Woodrow Wilson and the Americans for coming in kind of at the last minute and thinking that they can kind of dictate the peace treaty and dictate the terms of peace. And one by one, a lot of the things that Woodrow Wilson wanted, including making sure that there's no secret alliances, freedom of trade, aka freedom of seas, helping democracy in the colonized parts of the world. All these beautiful, like, grand visions he had of a kind of a democratic and safe world that no longer has warfare kind of get whittled away. One thing he kind of really is able to get, and he pushes, and it does get support, is the creation of a League of Nations. And this League of Nations, the goal is to obviously work together to stop these moments. I think what he thought is maybe he could get rid of all the 13 points, but if the League, or this is how I've taught it, if the League of Nations was there, perhaps the League of Nations would debate later about freedom of seas and secret alliances and preventing world wars from happening. So I don't know. It's my belief that Woodrow Wilson was willing to give up those other ones, but really wanted to keep the League of Nations because his hope was that the League of Nations ultimately, of all these diplomats from different countries coming to working together, would eventually lead to a more peace and safe world anyways. A little bit of argument there. The Treaty of Versailles comes over to the United States, and it has to get passed by these group of individuals called Congress. And Congress has been obviously in Capitol Hill, as you can see right here, has been in the news recently. Congress has two houses, as you guys know, right? The House of Representatives that meets on this side, and the Senate is where it meets on this side. Um, these individuals, Congress has to come together to declare war. They also have to come together to sign peace treaties, and that's kind of their role inside of how our Constitution has been created. It's not just done by the executive branch or the presidency. So this peace treaty comes, and a lot of the congressmen are actually quite critical of the League of Nations, this organization that they have to commit to, because what they're concerned about is that they're going to give up some of their independence. For example, if one of the League of Nations members perhaps were enter war or not enter war or do something, what would the commitment of the United States be? Because we're committed to the League of Nations. Well, we have to commit our troops. And there's a running vein in America that we want to be kind of independent of European problems of neutrality. And we can even see that today. A lot of people say, why are we involved in all these foreign wars? Why are we involved in all these foreign lands? A lot of arguments to be said about why we are. But nonetheless, that's, I think, a vein of our culture is, why are we involved in other people's stuff, right? And in this case, the League of Nations may force us legally, if we are part of the League of Nations, to be involved in other people's business. And the Congress kind of unifies and says, we do not want part of that plan. So one of the sad things about Woodrow Wilson is that he actually goes around trying to get this League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles signed, but it does not happen. And because it fails, as he goes, he actually goes on a trip on a train across the United States, trying to to put pressure on their senators, put pressure on the representatives to sign the League of Nations, going directly to the people to get this done. And when a doctor comes to him and goes, "Man, you're traveling so much, you're gonna die of exhaustion. You're literally working too hard, and you're not sleeping, you're not traveling." And he does, and he literally, I think he does die kind of in his efforts of trying to get this thing passed. So the League of Nations is not signed. The Treaty of Versailles is actually not ratified. We do not join the League of Nations. We kind of do our separate treaties with Germany and everybody else. But the League of Nations starts, and it starts without any participation from the United States, even though it came from Woodrow Wilson, which is kind of an irony. So that is the end of World War I. We are moving on from that. So that kind of wraps up World War I. Again, you might go, "Wow, we don't really talk about much about the wars." College Board really has a focus towards military history, and again, our participation in the war is so short. So hopefully, you understand some of the causes of the war and how it ended. Another thing that Khan Academy does is kind of going to go back a little bit. It's going to talk about what's happened at home during the war, since we've been talking about all the foreign parts. And one thing that's happening during the war is this Committee of Public Information is spewing out what we call propaganda, and obviously, propaganda is kind of usually images. I mean, when we think of propaganda and you Google it, like the first thing that comes up is posters. So you kind of think of it as images. Today, you could think of it as social media or other ways, but they're just usually falsehoods, or maybe some of you guys are like, this sounds like that yellow journalism you're talking about before. It's very similar. Exaggerations, usually using images to make you feel or act a certain way. So, been used by people for a long time. You could say that media is a form of propaganda in which we think. So, but at this time, there's obviously propaganda that is being created at this time to support the war effort and support the United States and get people to support war. Another thing that's happening during this time is something called the Great Migration. This is a great map that shows it. It's super cool, and we got these images on the side. But obviously, there's a movement from the south to the north, and what's happening, obviously, to the west as well. But what is happening is African Americans who, have been enjoying freedom, but in a very segregated and very racially divided South, so not necessarily experiencing full freedom, or full equality. Let's say that at least. They're seeing opportunities in the factories of the North, where there's a little bit more tolerance up there than the kind of the racist history and the slave history of the South. And so they are making this great migration movement forward. So a lot of our, Chicago, Detroit, Pittsburgh, New York, a lot of areas that you traditionally think, in cities that you traditionally think have like kind of a higher African American population, prior to this had a very limited population, other than those individuals who had fled during during their experiences of slavery or during the Civil War or during other items, right? But most of the African American population at this time really did stay in the South, right? Because of limited opportunities and what they knew. This opportunity now, when the war happens and all these men are sent out to go out and fight war, all these factory jobs open, and the African Americans come and start enjoying greater degrees of social equality, right? Again, not totally equal, but better degrees of equality. So that's one thing that's happening inside the United States. Another thing that's happening is something called the Espionage and Sedition Act. If you're accused of being a spy or accused of saying things against the government, you could be in jail. Some of you guys might go, wow, it sounds like directly against the freedom of speech. Remind ourselves that we have seen multiple times in warfare a limit of freedoms and civil liberties in the name of security and safety, and in this case, in the name of patriotism. So there were journals and newspapers and individuals who resisted the draft, who advocated for peace, who were anti-war, maybe pro-peace, who were arrested and jailed using this act in order to kind of mobilize the United States to support a war effort. So this is Tasker and Woodrow Wilson. Again, we kind of talked about the complexities of Woodrow Wilson and the complexities of history. Here we have this guy that's trying to make the world safe for democracy. He has this beautiful vision of the world about us working together in a League of Nations, all types of nations from all parts of the world, all different types of people and cultures, and I'm going to say the word colors, all coming together and kind of make it. Well, he has that, and then he segregates the armed forces. He segregates federal buildings. He supports this and gets this passed, which allows his federal government to basically jail people, who are doing freedom of speech. So, showing some of the issues that are happening, especially during crisis and warfare, and that's what's happening right now as we are going through a crisis. As I reflect on this, as we go through crisis, things get more kind of extreme and more emotional, right? And we're seeing this like being literally expelled out of the human spirit right now, the American spirit right now in our country. All right. Another thing is the 1900s immigration. During this time, immigration goes down because a lot of people aren't traveling due to the war that's happening. But you're going to see a consistent theme here, and we have seen a consistent theme of trying to deal with immigration, not just letting our borders completely open. And so in this case, it's going to come down to restrictions and quotas. And these restrictions and quotas, once again, are going to try to limit the traditional minorities. So Catholics are going to be trying to limited. Obviously, Asians are going to be trying to be limited. They've already kind of been limited in multiple acts prior to this as well. So you'll be learning about these immigration restrictions about them. Another thing is like Italians during this time or in the 1920s, you're going to see Sacco and Vanzetti, two Italians, I believe they're in Chicago, who are incorrectly tried for a murder and put to death. And it was done basically kind of on falsehoods and kind of racist beliefs and investigation. So we're going to continue to see that. Obviously, another restriction against immigration at this time is if you're part of the Central Powers, right? So if you're German, Italian, Austro-Hungarian, kind of those areas, during that time, you were probably going to be seen with a little bit more criticism due to your national origin and the involvement in the war. So same thing will happen in World War II, especially to my grandfather, since he was one of Japanese descent, where he will be actually interned. So yeah, those restrictions on immigration are happening on those groups. We're creating quota systems in which only certain groups for only a certain number of people from a certain country can come in during a certain year. So you'll start seeing these restrictions on immigration and kind of another part, right? You're seeing all these different parts of our history, and we still have these kind of questions of immigration. This kind of recentered towards our southern border, right? But at this time, it was kind of looking at Europeans. And it's pretty funny during this time, not funny, but I find ironic, that the border is open with our South, because we definitely need our Mexican labor to come to the United States, especially for our farming industry, especially here in the West. So that's what you're going to see during warfare. We're going to need the Mexican American population, and during peacetime, we're going to try to expel it. It's going to happen in World War II. I took an entire class kind of focused on that history, and read a book called Los Braceros, which was, the arms, about how Mexican American farmers came over to the United States during World War II to help out in the war effort, and then how they're treated after during peace, which is kind of the back and forth of immigration policy and American immigration policy. All right, guys. So that ends World War I at the home front, and we'll keep on moving on. I think the next event will be the Roaring Twenties. And what do you know? It's right now. I'm recording. It's 2021, and we are in some of the 20s right now. So we'll see again some parallels to our current history and see what's going on. All right, guys. Take care. We'll see you in the next one. Bye now.